The rain had turned the roads of northern France into mud by the autumn of 1944. American soldiers moving toward the front lines often noticed something strange when they passed wrecked German positions. Among the burned trucks and abandoned artillery pieces, there was sometimes a familiar shape parked quietly beside them. A small, square vehicle with a flat grille and wide tires. A Jeep. But it wasn't American. It had German soldiers sitting inside it. At first, the sight confused Allied troops. The Germans were supposed to be the masters of engineering, the nation of precision machines and perfect mechanical design. Yet here they were, driving captured American vehicles whenever they could get their hands on them. The reason was simple. The Jeep had become something the German army desperately needed but could never produce in large numbers. A machine that worked everywhere, carried everything, and never seemed to break. By the later years of the war, American officers were hearing the same comment again and again from prisoners of war. German soldiers admired many American weapons. They feared the bombers that turned cities into rubble. They respected the endless thunder of American artillery. But the vehicle they envied the most was the one that never made headlines. The little Jeep that seemed to appear everywhere the American army went. To understand why that mattered so much, you have to go back to a time when the United States Army barely existed. In 1939, the American military was not the giant war machine people imagine today. It was small, underfunded, and scattered across a country that had spent 2 decades trying to avoid foreign wars. Most of the Army's vehicles were outdated trucks or motorcycles. Officers understood that if war came, the Army would need something new, something small, fast, and tough enough to move across terrain where trucks could not go. The idea sounded simple. A light reconnaissance car. But the list of requirements the Army wrote in the summer of 1940 was so demanding that many companies laughed when they read it. The vehicle had to weigh barely more than half a ton. It had to carry 3 soldiers with equipment. It needed 4-wheel drive so it could climb hills, cross mud, and crawl through sand. It had to drive 50 miles per hour on roads but also creep along slowly enough for soldiers to scout ahead of an advancing column. And perhaps the most unbelievable requirement of all, the Army wanted a prototype built in less than 7 weeks. For most major manufacturers, the request seemed ridiculous. Large companies protected their reputations carefully. They preferred projects that allowed years of testing and development. Designing a completely new military vehicle in just weeks sounded like a guaranteed disaster. So the giants of American industry passed. But a tiny company in Pennsylvania did not. The American Bantam Car Company was struggling to survive. Like many small automakers during the Great Depression, it had nearly collapsed. The Army contract looked risky, but it also looked like salvation. There was just one problem. Bantam did not have enough engineers to design the vehicle. So the company called a man who had spent decades quietly working behind the scenes of the American auto industry. His name was Karl Probst. He was experienced, talented, and currently unemployed. When Bantam first contacted him, he almost refused. The payment was small. The timeline was absurd. But as he studied the Army's request, something about the challenge pulled him in. In July 1940, he arrived at the Bantam factory and began drawing. There were no elaborate design teams, no research departments, no months of planning. Probst worked with a handful of engineers, sketching ideas day and night while the clock ticked toward the Army's deadline. Within 5 days, he produced the core design. It was simple, almost brutally simple. Flat panels of steel, a sturdy ladder frame, wide tires, short wheelbase. Everything designed for strength, not beauty. Every component chosen because it could be built quickly and repaired easily. The prototype was assembled under intense pressure. Workers stayed overnight in the factory. Parts were improvised from existing vehicles whenever possible. And when the deadline arrived, the small team climbed into the vehicle and drove it straight to the Army testing grounds in Maryland. They arrived just before time ran out. The Army immediately began testing the strange little machine. It climbed slopes that trucks could not handle. It bounced across rough terrain without falling apart. It hauled equipment, soldiers, and trailers through mud that swallowed other vehicles. Within weeks, it had traveled thousands of miles during brutal testing. The Army realized something important very quickly. Bantam had proven the idea worked, but the company itself was too small to build the numbers the military would need. So the government did something controversial. It gave the design to larger manufacturers. Two companies stepped forward, Willys Overland and Ford. Both produced their own versions of the vehicle, each adding improvements. The most important change came from Willys, whose engineers installed a powerful engine that gave the little machine far more strength than anyone expected. When the final design was approved in 1941, mass production began almost immediately. And that was when the true power of American industry revealed itself. Factories that once built civilian cars suddenly shifted into wartime production. Assembly lines moved faster. Workers filled plants day and night. The small reconnaissance car that had started as a desperate experiment now rolled off production lines every few minutes. Soon the vehicle had a name everyone recognized: the Jeep. No one is completely certain where the nickname came from. Some said it was a shortened version of general purpose vehicle. Others believed soldiers borrowed the name from a cartoon character that could go anywhere and do anything. Whatever the origin, the name stuck. And the Jeep began spreading across the world. In North Africa, the desert was vast and unforgiving. Sand swallowed heavy trucks, and tanks struggled to move across the endless dunes. But the Jeep handled the terrain surprisingly well. Its four-wheel drive and powerful engine allowed it to race across ground where heavier vehicles stalled. British commandos quickly realized what they had. They stripped unnecessary parts from the vehicle, mounted machine guns on the hood and sides, and turned the Jeep into a fast attack platform. On dark desert nights, small groups of commandos drove deep into enemy territory. They attacked airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground before disappearing back into the desert. German pilots began to fear the sudden roar of engines in the night. In Europe, the Jeep became the nervous system of the Allied armies. Officers used it to move between headquarters and front lines. Medics used it to evacuate wounded soldiers. Engineers used it to carry equipment and lay communication wires across battlefields. Sometimes soldiers bolted heavy machine guns onto the vehicle and used it as a mobile gun platform. Other times they attached trailers filled with ammunition, food, or fuel. The Jeep was never meant to do all those jobs. But it did them anyway. And everywhere it appeared, German troops noticed. The German army had its own light vehicle called the Kübelwagen. It was cleverly designed by Ferdinand Porsche and worked well on roads. But it lacked four-wheel drive and struggled in rough terrain. When German soldiers captured a Jeep, they quickly understood the difference. The American machine was stronger, more powerful, and most importantly, easier to fix. If something broke, mechanics could repair it quickly with simple tools. Spare parts from one Jeep fit perfectly into another. That kind of standardization was rare in German equipment, where small design changes often made parts incompatible. So, whenever German troops captured a Jeep, they often kept it. Photographs from the war show German soldiers proudly driving them across occupied territory. Some even painted German markings over the American stars. By late 1944, the Jeep had become so common that it seemed to appear everywhere across Allied battlefields. Supply roads buzzed with them. Command posts were surrounded by them. Airfields used them to tow aircraft and equipment. To German observers, it looked as if every American soldier had his own personal vehicle. That impression wasn't accurate. But it said something important about the scale of American production. By the end of the war, more than 600,000 Jeeps had been built. They were shipped to Europe, Africa, the Pacific, and even the frozen battlefields of the Soviet Union. For the German army, which struggled to produce vehicles in large numbers, the sight was astonishing. The difference between the two nations' industrial philosophies had become painfully clear. Germany focused on precision engineering. Many of its machines were complex and carefully crafted. They were impressive pieces of technology, but they took time to build. America focused on something else: speed. Factories were designed to produce huge quantities quickly. Engineers simplified designs so parts could be made by workers with minimal training. Instead of perfect machines, they built reliable ones that could be produced by the hundreds of thousands. The result was overwhelming. The Jeep was not the most advanced vehicle of the war. It was not heavily armored. It did not carry massive weapons, but it was everywhere. It carried commanders across battlefields. It hauled supplies to the front. It pulled artillery guns, transported wounded soldiers, and served as a mobile platform for radios and weapons. It became so essential that many soldiers joked the war could not continue without it. One war correspondent wrote that the Jeep was as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as nimble as a mountain goat. That description followed the vehicle for the rest of the war. By 1945, when Germany finally collapsed, Allied officers began interviewing captured German commanders about what they had learned from the conflict. Some expected them to praise American bombers. Others expected them to mention the endless barrages of artillery. But again and again, the answer came back to the same machine: the Jeep. To those generals, the little vehicle symbolized something much larger. It represented the power of American industry. A nation that could design a machine in weeks and then build hundreds of thousands of them while fighting a global war. The Jeep was proof that the United States had become something the Axis powers had never truly understood: an industrial giant. When the war ended, many of the factories that produced Jeeps returned to civilian production. But the vehicle itself refused to disappear. Farmers discovered it was perfect for working fields and hauling equipment. Explorers used it to travel through mountains and jungles. Civilians bought versions adapted for everyday life. The military machine had quietly become a cultural icon. Yet the man who first sketched the design in 5 frantic days never became famous. Karl Probst returned to engineering work after the war and lived a relatively quiet life. The millions of people who later drove Jeeps across farms, deserts, and highways rarely knew his name. But the soldiers who depended on the vehicle during the war never forgot it. For them, the Jeep was more than a machine. It was the thing that got them through mud, across rivers, over hills, and sometimes out of danger. It was the little vehicle that seemed to survive everything. And in the end, that small, boxy machine told a larger story about the war itself. Not just about weapons or battles, but about how a nation that had once seemed unprepared could suddenly transform its factories, its workers, and its ideas into something powerful enough to change the course of history. 600,000 times, American workers proved that simple machines built in massive numbers could shape the outcome of a global conflict. And they did it with a vehicle that was never meant to be famous, just useful.